If we continue on the way we're going, we just have less and less resiliency in the system, less and less ability to roll with the punches of climate change.
In this ClimateGenn episode, I'm speaking with Professor Paul Behrens, British Academy Global Professor at the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford in the UK. Paul is the keynote speaker at the Sustainability in Drinks conference being held in London on the 21st of October, where he will be highlighting the incredibly fragile state of food production and supply, both in the UK and further afield. This fragility is being exacerbated by climate change.
Food prices will be going up because climate change will be hitting food production in a world that is also seeing increasing demand for food.
Here we discuss the changes urgently required to help us navigate a more resilient pathway to the future. Aside from the Sustainability in Drinks conference on the 21st of October, Paul is also part of a broader presentation being given at the Westminster Hall in London on the 27th of November. This national emergency briefing on climate change will be given to MPs as well as other government officials and business leaders. Please check the links to both sites in the notes. In the next episode, I speak with author Andy Nether about his newly published book, Rooted in Change, The Stories Behind Sustainable Wine, co-authored with Jane Masters, Master of Wine. Thank you to all listeners, commenters, and members. There are many more episodes being recorded, so please do subscribe to stay up to date. Paul, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much for taking the time. And I know you've been back in the UK for a while now. Can you give us some insight as to where you're working and the kind of areas you're focusing your energy on?
Oh, so nice to chat to you again, Nick. Yeah. So I'm actually at the University of Oxford now. I'm at the Oxford Martin School. I work in food systems and looking at how to both reduce the environmental impacts of how we produce food, but also to make the food system more resilient to climate change and, yeah, the other environmental changes that we see. Just moving back to London, though, and moving to the UK, I've been astonished by the changes in the country. It's like a country that I no longer know in terms of the climate. The last time I lived here was about 20 years ago. So it's like seeing 20 years of climate change all at once. And it is otherworldly for me. It's the only way to put it. It's like the country I knew no longer exists.
When you take that gap that you've just talked about and you've come back into a new climate sort of regime in a way, how does that integrate with the work that you're actually focusing on with food systems?
It's obviously a really difficult time for UK agriculture. We've had several years of just some terrible yields, and this has had some knock-on effects on food prices and inflation. And we've seen some studies suggesting that about a third of the food price inflation that we saw recently was driven by climate change. So it's at the top of my mind all the time, and it really is pushing me towards thinking, okay, how do some of the food system transitions that we often talk about, like these much more environmentally friendly and better for our health transitions that we need, how might they also be far more resilient to the climate impacts that we're seeing and we're going to continue to experience as they get worse?
You talk about these transitions from where we've been and where you might
Mm.
call that conventional agriculture in the modern period to where we've got to be. Where are we on that sort of scale?
Oh, we're really just starting. I think we're really starting. I think we're quite a long way behind the energy transition. I think probably sort of 10 to 20 years. I think there's been some small movements. We've seen a little bit of a change in the ways in which we at least think about agriculture and what agriculture looks like and how we should be producing food. This transition really is made up of these three areas, which is dietary change, reductions in food waste, and improvements in production. Now, all of them are essential. Not one of them gets us to the position that we need to be in, but they're not all created equal either. And dietary transitions are an absolute necessity. They are a non-negotiable for the food system transformation. So I often focus a lot on these dietary shifts, and these dietary shifts is basically eating more plants. And to your question about have we seen some development, some progress here. We are starting to see some areas around the world, in Europe mainly, and one of the really sort of standout policies is the Danish plant-based action plan. This action plan aims to improve the amount of plants that are being eaten across the entire community. And they've targeted the supply chain so that you can really give farmers the security that they need for transitioning to growing more plants. And I think that's really important is, if a farmer wants to start growing something else or wants to start shifting their production, they really need the certainty. Because actually, for the first few years, as they're making these investments, as they're trying new things out, they may not be making as much money. And so they really need to know that the market's going to be there many years in the future. And one of the best things I think of this plan is basically saying we're going to make more plants a priority for our public procurement. So if you go to the hospital, if you go to schools, if you go to prisons, wherever you go in sort of like the public sector, you're going to be meeting and eating more plants. And what that does is it provides that security for the farmers to make that shift. And that's a large part why the farmers were behind it. So there's about 170 million euro on this program. It's not just procurement, they're also training chefs, they're also looking at new alternatives, they're doing lots of different things along the supply chain and sort of seeding a lot of research and development as well. So it's quite an exciting development. And because they also have the presidency of the EU at the moment, they're also sort of pushing this sort of plant-based diplomacy as well, which is really interesting. Maybe just to highlight why this shift towards more plants is so important. In our modeling, across high-income nations, if we were to eat a diet that's healthier for us and healthier for the planet, we would reduce emissions about 61%. It's a huge number. I mean, so it really does make a difference. And that's not a completely plant-rich diet. I mean, there's still dairy, there's still meat, and about a burger once every 2 weeks. So the other big part of this dietary change is the way in which it changes the amount of land we need. Because, well, basically animal agriculture takes up a lot of land. And so, for example, this diet in the UK, if we were to adopt it, we'd save an area almost the size of Scotland. And the fact of the matter is we have all these competing demands for land. And if we want to meet our biodiversity targets, if we want timber buildings, if we want better production, so if we want to look at that production part, we want to look at, more intercropping, multi-cropping, what people often think about in terms of regenerative agricultural approaches. We're going to need more land for that. And the only way we get that land is through this change. And this is why the focus has to be all the time on eating more plants.
When you talked about Denmark there, you're saying it in a way that they've got the knowledge. The knowledge has been implemented through sort of structural policy and given funding, which doesn't sound like a lot of funding when you're talking about food systems, which are critical to every nation. Why is that not happening in the UK, which you've just cited the opportunity versus the risk?
It's a really good question. I mean, and you're right. It's not a lot of money. Obviously, Denmark's a smaller country. They're just at the start of that journey. So it'll be really interesting to see how much of a difference this makes in changing the food environment. One of the reasons why we don't see this in the UK so much is, I think, often a lack of joined up thinking between different ministries. Is this the domain of health? Is this the domain of agriculture? Is this domain, when you look at food, it crosses over many different areas. And if your ministries are not talking and your departments are not connecting on these issues, then it can often be difficult. Now, the government is putting together various frameworks based off consultations earlier this year on, say, land use, for example. But typically, the government tends to be behind where we need to be. And often there is this misunderstanding or this misapprehension that to be developing this idea for more plant-rich diets would somehow go against people's freedom of consumption of what they would like to eat. And the real core thing to remember there is we're not free in what we eat anyway. We only have what's available to us in supermarkets and in restaurants and in petrol stations or whatever. And that is heavily dependent on the way in which you've set up the food system in the first place. So it's heavily dependent on the regulations, on the subsidies for farmers, on how you view and treat rural regions. So this is not an equal playing field in the first instance. So all the research shows that we would save, hundreds of billions in health costs every year if we were to sort our food system out and eat more plants. If you just take the health system alone, so if you look at healthcare, social care, welfare, productivity, and sort of the sort of the human cost of current diets, then the estimates out there suggest about 260 billion pounds per year in costs are borne by society in the UK due to diets. I think worldwide we're in the sort of the trillions. So I think this is really incumbent upon us to sort out not just for the environmental impacts, but also the health impacts.
Just coming back to the risks of not doing this, to the space factor, the rising temperatures. I mean, what does a business as usual approach to food systems do for us in terms of where we're going right now?
If we continue on the way we're going, we just have less and less resiliency in the system, less and less ability to roll with the punches of climate change. And we are going to have to continuing health crises from the way in which we eat too many high fat, high salt, high sugar foods, and too many livestock products as well. And we're just going to continue to have this burden of disease in the country. It's going to be costing us more money. At the same time, our food prices will be going up because climate change will be hitting food production in a world that is also seeing increasing demand for food. So as I say, already we're seeing this increase in food prices, and the research on this suggests that this will continue. This is a chronic effect, that food prices will continue to increase. Some research suggests that food prices will increase between 1 and 3 percentage points, so an extra 1 to 3% per year by 2035 based on climate impacts. Now, the thing you've got to remember on the modeling on this is it's very hard, extremely hard to model all the different impacts on the food system. So in general, when I look at a model or an outcome of a model, I typically think that it's probably going to be a little bit worse than what you read. And that's borne out also by historical analysis as well. So if I go through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports through the years, you can see that actually what we thought would be happening at higher degrees of warming is happening now at lower degrees of warming. So we've always erred on this side of the caution. And the reality has been that we've been hit harder. And I think that that's equally true for food as it is for other climate impacts like droughts, heat waves, floods. So if we carry on as we are, we're just going to be very fragile to those increasing pressures. If we do make this change in this land use, for example, this is a really good example of, if we change that land use and we were able to potentially rewild some of that land and produce food in more environmentally sustainable and also resilient ways on that land, we could buffer some of the climate impacts. So rewilded land, for example, is just much better at absorbing floodwaters than pasture, say, or revegetated land can actually absorb storm surges. So this is very clear from the scientific literature that if you actually sort of rewild there, you're actually able to take the edge off storms and the impacts of climate change. Now, it can't do all the job, because these impacts are big. These extreme weather events are getting worse, but for still storm surges, you're talking about 2 to 3 kilometers per second in the winds, for example, can make a difference. For flooding, it's much better. Like the return on flooding, for example, for every £1 spent on flood defense, you get about £8 back. And most of that will be things like allowing nature to absorb that flood water higher upstream before it gets to the population centres.
Yeah, I've been documenting the regenerative practices being undertaken by wine estates in Alentejo in southern Portugal, and looking at the boost to resilience from these techniques, where plants can exist for days in plus 45 degrees heat, maximizing plant shade, protecting the soils, sharing ideas with other farmers, water economy. It's all sort of working as integrated systems as a strategy that pushes the threshold of viability for farming in extreme drought conditions. And saying all this, there's still a limit to what these farmers can adapt to.
Yeah, so there is this climate change limit that you will get hit by, and there's some adaptation that you can do underneath that. Now, some of that adaptation stuff that we could be doing at very low cost that's better for the environment as well. Things like we were talking before about the added organic matter, so the mulching that you put down around the vines, for example, which protects the vines from a lot of heat. That can also be very good for the soil. Those come at very low cost. But then if we start to look at higher cost interventions, which we may eventually need, because let's face it, this is going to get worse and these regions are going to get hotter, then those interventions just get very expensive. So if this is sort of further irrigation or misting or whatever you want to put in, in between vines, I'm not an expert in wine, but that's going to cost money. And that money then is going to be passed on to the consumer. And so again, it comes back to this, well, how much are we going to be paying for this? And it's going to be really sort of quite clear to our pockets what the impacts of climate change on food systems are going to be as we move forwards. This is true when you look across many different foods. It's not just the plant foods that you can think of like crops wilting. And actually, my impression of the situation that we're in now is that animal products will become more expensive faster than the crop products will become more expensive, and the reason for that is that the animals are like us. I mean, we struggle in heat now. We struggle during the summer, but we have to keep inside, we have to keep cool. And yet, this is true for the animals. So, the heat stress on animals is really going to affect the productivity of animals. And it's also going to affect how much money is spent on keeping the animals cool and healthy. So, some studies suggest that we could see 10% reductions in global dairy yield. And that's even with high adaptation, under future climate change. So even with all of the adaptations involved, we still see that decline. The other area of that is that animals also eat the crops. And so the crops that are getting damaged by climate change, they're going to get more expensive. And then, that's also going to pass through the animal system. And so I think, one way or another, we will be going towards this more plant-rich future, either because we decide to do it now and decide to prevent all that damage and actually reduce all of these impacts and do a much better job for our own health and our planetary health and feel a lot better for it now. Or we're going to be forced to do it in the future as prices just continually grind up. And it puts especially meat out of the range of most people's budgets.
Another observation from my interactions with many wine producers across Europe, in the UK and beyond, is that they're measuring everything much more closely, especially the sort of the impact assessment side. And one topic that comes up quite a bit is measuring and monetizing soil organic carbon. Have you any thoughts on whether soil organic carbon can be measured and verified to create a source of what is often much needed revenue?
Yeah, it's a very open area. I mean, just coming back to your point, farmers are already struggling before we being hit by climate extremes and having to adapt to this. So, farming has never been that really secure job that you would hope it would be. And, partly it's the things that the farmers produce, but it's also the pressures that farmers are under when it comes to the purchases of food. So the big processors and producers, and the pressures that they are under just also from our own consumption to keep prices low as possible. And so, as a fraction of our disposable budget, food has sort of really shrunk over the decades in terms of how much money we've spent on it. And so farming has always been a struggle, and this will continue to be more of a struggle as climate hits. So in many cases, farmers are now sort of looking at diversifying. I mean, they've always been sort of like looking at diversifying into different areas and trying to find other streams of income. Now, previously, there were subsidies based on the amount of land use. And we could talk a lot more about subsidies. About 82% of subsidies in the EU, for example, end up subsidizing animal products simply because they take up more space. And so because a land-based subsidy will end up subsidizing those products. So it's kind of the worst case scenario in that sense. In the UK now, we've moved towards more environmental land management schemes where farmers are now being paid to bring back natural elements onto the field. So sort of buffer zones around the field, trees in the field, and being paid for sort of these environmental services. And so the question about soil organic carbon then is, to what extent is that a valuable income stream for farmers that they can diversify away from, just simply the food that they're producing? The sort of issues with the soil organic carbon is that it's a very difficult to measure and monitor value. There's a lot of change through the year. There's a lot of things that can change with the depth. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to ensure that the carbon that you're getting into that soil is actually sort of permanent, and to what level that's actually there. It's not necessarily an approach I would sort of always advocate for. I think, more direct approaches, such as the rewilding that I mentioned before, where you actually sort of just either actively or passively allowing ecosystems to come back on patches of land. I think it's a far more effective way of getting that benefit, but you're also getting the biodiversity benefit. You're also getting the climate adaptation benefit. So I think it's an area that's very interesting. It's something that farmers could and potentially should be paid for. But the question will always be, how are you going to monitor that? And how are you going to deal with the incentives to always overestimate that? And the more political questions about what models will you use to make those payments? Because you could be in a situation where if you don't sort of get those models right, that you could be incentivizing or at least paying out for the outcomes which are not as good as you thought they would be. You can also set up systems of incentives in the wrong way, where you're encouraging certain types of production, which are actually fundamentally worse for the environment. So if we look at sort of biodiversity net gain schemes, it could be that actually we are incentivizing the ecosystems which we need the least. So there's research that shows that under the current points-based system in the UK, for example, the forestry that we would like to see more of is actually the least most incentivized outcome of the current incentives-based system. So, we're not getting the right results. So it takes a lot of monitoring, and there's a lot of politics involved in how do you actually build those models up? Because, of course, this is people's livelihoods and how they might think about how they might change what they do for a living. And so there's, notwithstanding the fact then you've got the sort of the big industries and processors, above them buying the food and then marketing that food.
Okay, yeah. So that's kind of ongoing sort of discussion.
I think what we don't want to be in a situation where we're paying out every year for a benefit that we're not actually getting. And actually, it might be better just to be spending that money on more direct, obvious benefits like the ecosystem restoration that I just mentioned, the re-wetting of wetlands. That might just be a better approach than trying to measure farm by farm the amount of soil organic carbon.
I just want to come back to the whole. I think the core part of your message is about this moving towards a more plant-based diet, which would allow the land to be reused for better purposes and build our overall resilience. These are big cultural shifts, which, again, I just wonder, because I come from a wine background, linking wine to food is a sort of age-old writing exercise, if you like. But and practice, we do it all the time. We're trying to think, oh, what would go well with this? What would go well with this? And most of the classics and almost cliches are very, very meat intensive, very, very seafood intensive, dairy and so on. In terms of getting that transition, I think there's a creativity side of this that we need to really get into. And I'm just more thinking aloud at the moment, but how have you engaged or found the cultural response to what you're saying in terms of who's listening, who's not?
So what we find is generally the environment comes pretty down on the list of people's choices when they when they have food. It's more about health, it's about culture, it's about, what people's habits are like. And we really need to attack that area head on. And that's why in the sort of the Danish plan that I mentioned earlier, they're looking at educating chefs and having really delicious new dishes available. I think this idea of wine is a really key one, isn't it? I mean, it is very European in a sense, meat heavy, dairy heavy. I mean, if you think about, say, pairing, Mexican food, you think beer, don't you? So wine goes quite heavily with European foods that tend to be quite meat heavy. So I think, yeah, I mean, developing new pairings would be a lovely idea. One thing I always think about when I think about this plant-rich shift is that it is eating more plants, and that's how it's sort of framed in the Danish action plan. And the nice thing about that is actually we eat only a handful of different types of plants each week. We might, if we're lucky, we might be eating, I don't know, 20 to 30 different types of plant, when there are actually tens of thousands of plants that are edible out there, and they have wonderful different flavors, and we don't have access to them right now. And this comes back again to this food environment. We're not free to make those decisions. I'm not free to, go to the shops and pick up, any of the many hundreds of types of potatoes that are around, or, I might get a choice between sweet potato chips and normal chips, but, that's it. So I think, for me, a lot of the time, it's a question of exploration. It's exploring diets, it's exploring new dishes, it's exploring new pairings. It's not a story of cutting things out. It's a story of more, more health, more plants, more nature, more land, more environment. And if we do this right, I really think that we could see a rural renaissance where we see people wanting to go onto the fields, into the countryside. At the moment, we've got this mental health crisis, which is horrendous among farmers. Well, it should not be that way. It should be a really exciting job that you're out there bringing back nature, being more climate resilient, producing healthy, sustainable food for everyone. And it should be something that, people are jumping at to do. And so that's a sort of a future I'd like to see. And I think that's only really possible if we address both the consumption side. So we change what you're mentioning there in terms of, the way in which we think about what we eat and on our diets, but also on the production side. And we change how we incentivize and support farmers through this transition.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's the cultural side, and this is really just sort of to finish on, really, but there's also this political structural side. And I know that you're part of a wider MP's briefing next month. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how, or can people be supportive in any way?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so this is going to be a national emergency briefing, and this is a sort of a COVID emergency style briefing about climate change and nature in the UK. And we've already got many MPs signed up. I think over 100. We're going to have business leaders, cultural leaders, faith leaders there, and it'll be down in Westminster. We'll be talking about national security in terms of food security. We're going to have a lieutenant general talking, a surgeon talking in terms of health. And so it's going to be a briefing of a number of different angles of climate change and what this means for the UK going forwards. And really trying to increase the ranking of climate change on politicians' concerns, because I think as of late, with various conflicts around the world, we've seen a reduction in the aspirations and also the attention that's being paid to climate change and nature. And, one of the really scary things about that is it's my opinion that actually a lot of the destabilization that we're seeing in different countries is already driven by climate change. So if we look at the food price inflation, like I mentioned before, well, we saw a cost of living crisis. Now, it wasn't all driven by climate change. It was a third, but that's a significant proportion. It's enough to push society beyond the brink. Society can deal with a certain amount, and then you get a little bit more, and then it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So this briefing is all about trying to raise climate change back up the priority list, and it's also to inform politicians that the British public and publics around the world are far more for climate action than they think they are. And so often the support for climate action and for nature action is often double what people think it is, and actually even more than that than MPs. MPs don't want much action, and actually they want a huge amount. So, and people can support the National Emergency Briefing by going on to the website to request that their MP attends the briefing. We'll also be showing clips from the briefing in various organisations, National Trust, various faith organisations, different councils in the future. So people will hopefully be able to see some of the clips from the briefing as well in the future.
It came up in a previous episode actually talking about military exposure to climate change. And one of the things that was mentioned there is that climate change it's not so much an issue on its own these days. It's a major component in every single other issue. So when you mentioned the conflicts, there was huge amount of pressure from climate impacts already. And it was incredible that the costs that the climate element was bringing to absolutely everything.
Famously, the military have called it a threat multiplier for a very long time, and the military, going back decades, has been worried about this and writing reports about this for a very long time to different militaries around the world, and they're well aware of what this looks like on the ground now. So we've got to turn this around. We've got to turn this around from a sort of a spiral where politics decays, we get more climate action skepticism, more of this sort of pulling back from net zero. We've got to turn this around to a spiral where we actually improve the sort of everyday life for people through many of the changes that we need to see. And we need to organise this in such a way that it's going to be looking after everybody through this transition. So yeah, it's a worrying picture that we're in, and I think that's why this adaptation side of the picture is becoming ever more important. And some of the interventions that you mentioned in Portugal, and some of the changes that we see across the English and the British countryside is going to be so important going forwards.
Okay, and just a positive note to end on. And one thing that each of us can do to make a positive impact in the whole food system discussion.
Oh, for the food system, that's just really easy with eating more plants. But we vote 3 times a day when we eat. We change the entire system. I mean, there's this big conversation between systemic change and individual change. And in the food system, this is one area where it just doesn't really apply. You are able to put a very big difference onto the system by what you choose to eat. And hopefully that will get better in the future. And there'll be more and more opportunities for other people as well. So that's a systemic change. But right now, that's what you can do. But the most important thing other than that is then to tell people about it. If you do it, that's great. But we're social beings. We copy one another, we imitate one another. There's a reason why we listen to one another, we take on board what we say, and we have to talk to one another about this. And whatever you think works for those people that you talk to, you could talk about the health impacts, how you've been feeling from this change, the environmental sort of relief to know that you're not sort of doing that damage anymore. You'd be talking about the animal welfare, whatever you think lands with somebody else, or just simply say what your journey was. So, for my journey, I've not always been plant-based. I ate meat regularly up until about 15 odd years ago. And I've just been on a journey. And it's been a really good journey for me personally, both sort of psychologically in terms of my research and seeing what damage my previous diet was doing. And now I don't have to feel bad about that damage all the time, but also physically in terms of my own health it's been a real improvement. And that is borne out through the epidemiological evidence on that. So, just talk about it.
Thank you very much. It's been great to speak to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
If you are concerned about the future, then why not travel with me through every COP conference from COP21 in Paris to COP28 in Dubai by ordering my book, COP Out: How Governments Have Failed the People on Climate. In COP Out, you'll gain insights into what is actually going on in these supposed world-saving conferences and how we have ended up in this dire era of dangerous consequences. You can order COP Out via the link in the notes or on any online bookstore worldwide, in paperback or audio version.